estimated at more than $1 billion US. That money has fueled their rapid progress across northern Iraq in recent weeks. Earlier, I spoke to two experts about the vast wealth controlled by this militant group. I began by asking about the many ways ISIS makes money.
One of the most remarkable things about ISIS is the diversity of its funding and the size of it. So we're looking at criminal activities, donations, and even sort of regular business-like activities and taxation. You know, they function as a sort of semi-state.
And like a corporation, they actually issue annual reports.
That's right. There have been two. They call them al-Naba, the news, and they are a sort of glossy brochure of their activities, what they spend their money on, principally, rather than how they raise it. But the whole range of things. I think there were 8,000 individual actions they catalogued last year, and those range from car bombings, assassinations, to the conversion of apostates.
Right. It's actually incredible when you think about it that they're not just listing how they spend money, but beheadings, crucifixions, suicide bombings, and this is all in a report in order, presumably, to attract funding. Fawaz, Gerges, thanks for being with us as well. One of the accusations directed at Gulf countries in particular is that they are allowing some of these charities that funnel money to these extreme insurgent groups to operate. How much of that funding comes from Gulf charities?
A great deal. In fact, much of the funding, not just for the Islamic State, but for al-Nusra Front and for the Islamic Front, comes from private individuals, from charities, from networks, from clerics who basically collect funding for these groups in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Kuwait, in the United Arab Emirates. What has happened, though, in the last 2-3 weeks, the sweeping advance by the Islamic State was really an awakening call for most governments, including the Gulf states. Now, as you know, the Islamic State is listed as a terrorist organization in Saudi Arabia. Any Saudi individual who basically joins any of these groups is considered basically under the terrorist law. And I think the Gulf states in particular are becoming more and more vigilant in trying to prevent individuals of sending funding to these groups.
But Fawaz, before this ISIS advance, did Gulf states encourage or simply tolerate these charities and this network of money directed at insurgent groups coming from within their borders?
Let me be direct here. I think initially at the beginning of the Syrian uprising, most governments in the region, whether you're talking about Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United, basically shut their eyes and ears to what's happening. They were supporting the Syrian opposition. And much of the funding basically did not go to the Syrian army, the Free Syrian Army. It went to al-Nusra Front, it went to Islamic groups. So initially that's how it was. But of course, in the last 1.5 years, there has become much more awareness about the insidious nature of both the al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State. And of course, I think in the last 5 months or so, you have now Saudi Arabia taking some major measures in order to prevent funding going to the Islamic Front and al-Nusra Front.
And Sam Jones, one of the things you say is that ISIS is one of those groups that relies less on donations for its funding, right?
Yeah, I mean, donations are still a part of what they take, but much less than other groups like, as Fawaz was saying, Jabhat al-Nusra, some of the other groups in Syria, which rely much more. And I think ISIS, according to some Department of Defense documents, about 5%, maybe 10% of their funding is from Gulf donations.
So they're self-sustained, in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at, for example, how much money they claim to have taken from the central bank in Mosul, how much money their income is alleged to be from extortion rackets, taxation, this is the wealthiest jihadi organization in the world, and the wealthiest we've seen ever.
And very well run, it seems, Fawaz.
I mean, what has happened in the last 2 weeks or so, now the Islamic State basically controls all oil fields inside Syria, in particular in eastern Syria. In Deir ez-Zor. These oil fields produce about 20,000–30,000 barrels of oil a day. Not to mention in Iraq, I mean, in some parts, gas fields, and the resources and the taxation. I mean, people don't realize. Go to Al-Raqqa. Al-Raqqa, one of the major provinces which the Islamic State controls, they have a very rigorous system of taxation, of basically, and criminality. They have been able to collect tens of millions of dollars by kidnapping. I mean...
so pure criminal activity there. And when you say the Islamic State, that's what ISIS wants to be, refers to itself as now. But just geopolitically, where does ISIS fit in the grand scheme of things in the Middle East?
Well, look, ISIS, even though the Islamic State is part of the al-Qaeda family, the parent organization, there are major differences in ideology and tactics. While the al-Qaeda Central, the major target, was the far enemy, the United States and its allies, the major target of the Islamic State is the local enemy, the near enemy. The Shia. I mean, the Islamic State is a precursor of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Remember Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. And basically, if there was a raison d'etre, is to trigger all-out sectarian strife between Sunnis and Shiites. And the question is, Hala, how do we explain the resurgence of the Islamic State? Increasing sectarian tensions in Syria and Iraq, in Yemen, have allowed the Islamic State to find a refuge, a shelter, a hadina sha'biyya, a social base, and also to sell itself as the vanguard, the supporter, the defender of Ahl Sunnah, the Islamic State. And this is why we're seeing now the resurgence of the Islamic State as a result of the wars in Syria and Iraq.
Sam, last question to you. How has ISIS managed such an efficient degree of operational organization? As we were saying, they're running like a corporation, they're issuing reports.
Well, they are a very tightly controlled organization. I mean, we know very little about who runs ISIS. We know Abu al-Bakr al-Baghdadi at the top, but we don't know much beyond that, other than the fact that this is centrally commanded, very tightly controlled. There's a sort of cadre of Ba'athists, ex-Iraqi military people who have a high degree of experience in organizational skills, things like that, who have built this organization over a period of years. I mean, this has been going on, the money has been coming from Mosul for years. This is not something that has occurred in the last 6 months.